Miriam locked in expect her summer sabbatical to begin with a sealed envelope and no return address. The packet arrived one morning at Yale's Sterling Library, addressed in meticulous Hebrew script. Inside were faded parchment fragments, pages that looked centuries old. At first glance, she assumed it was an elaborate hoax. But when she recognized the faint outline of an ancient seal tied to the Qumran scrolls, her pulse quickened. The language wasn't purely Hebrew. It bore hints of Aramaic, mixed with something else, something almost American in tone. These weren't just religious texts. They hinted at a shared prophecy between two nations divided by oceans, yet tethered by something older than governments. Covenant. Her mentor, Professor Isaac Dresner, confirmed her suspicions. The parchment was real and dangerous, according to him. It referenced a book of two nations, a record of a forgotten spiritual pact between early prophets of a land that would become Israel and pilgrims destined to found America. As absurd as it sounded, the fragments contained symbols found both in Dead Sea Scrolls and on early Puritan gravestones. Miriam felt a strange magnetic pull and obligation to uncover the rest of the manuscript, but Dresner urged caution. Some truths, he said, have been buried for a reason. That night, while digitizing parchment, her screen flickered just for a second, and then the Yale network crashed. When it came back, the file was gone. Miriam checked a hard copy, only to find one of the pages missing. Confused and rattled, she reviewed campus security footage but found nothing. No one had entered the restricted archive wing. The loss was a warning, subtle but deliberate. A sense of surveillance crept into her mind, as if some presence had been triggered by the manuscript's unveiling. She wasn't just studying history now. She was part of something living. Later that week, a sealed manila envelope appeared on her apartment door. Inside was a photo of the missing page, along with a handwritten note. Some doors should remain closed. Stop now or next time, it won't be a page. No signature, no fingerprints. Her instinct was to alert the authorities, but something told her it wouldn't help. Miriam instead doubled down, secure backups, encrypted drives, off-site copies. Whatever this book contained, someone feared its truth deeply, and that made her want it even more. Her next step was clear. She had to trace the document's origin. The paper was sand-textured and mineral-rich, likely from the Judean desert. The linguistic markers matched findings from a lesser-known cache of scrolls unearthed in the 1980s near Ein Gedi. Miriam booked a flight to Jerusalem. Her heart pounded as she stared out the plane window. Somewhere across that desert, an ancient story waited, one that tied the fate of her homeland with that of another, and perhaps the future of both. Ben Gurion Airport buzz of controlled chaos that only made Miriam more alert. She stepped through the security checkpoint, clutching her leather satchel tighter. Inside was a high-resolution scan of the fragments she had received, her only remaining copy. As she walked into the dry heat of Tel Aviv, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Though she told no one her exact itinerary, a man in a gray linen suit seemed to appear at every terminal, always just out of reach, always looking away when she turned. Whether it was paranoia or truth, her instincts told her to trust no one, yet someone was clearly watching her steps. She checked into a small, modest hotel near the Old City in Jerusalem. That night, as the city's layered lights flickered across ancient stones, she reviewed her notes, highlighting phrases about twin bloodlines and a shared covenant. One passage stood out. The law shall rise twice, once under desert sun, once under colonial sky. It was a strange poetic line, hinting that America's founders might have knowingly mirrored something older from Israel's own spiritual past. The implication wasn't just theological, it was geopolitical. She jotted down a single word: echoes. The next morning, she met her contact, Yonatan Halavai, a soft-spoken archivist from the Israel Antiquities Authority. With a trimmed beard and steady gaze, Yonatan didn't seem surprised by what she showed him. In fact, he finished one of the translated lines before she could. "You're not the first to come searching," he said, "but you may be the last." He led her to a restricted vault beneath a museum wing, where shelves of unclassified artifacts rested in organized disarray. One locked drawer held a parchment that mirrored hers almost perfectly. Another piece of the Book of Two Nations. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. Yonatan explained that rumors of the manuscript had circulated since the 1960s, whispered among scholars but never publicly acknowledged. It had always been too controversial, implying that America's ideological birth was spiritually entwined with Israel's ancient law. The implications, he said, could unravel modern alliances or renew them, depending on who controls the narrative. Miriam understood now why governments would want to keep it hidden. It wasn't just a document. It was a weapon or a cure. She needed time, but she knew time was the one thing she wouldn't be granted. That evening, as she walked along the old stone alleys near the Western Wall, a voice called her name. It was a man from the airport, the one in the linen suit. He didn't approach. He simply said, "You've seen too much, Miriam. Don't open what was never meant to be found." Then he vanished into the crowd. Her heart thudded. The shadows of Jerusalem weren't just historical. They were alive and watching. Whatever was in that book wasn't buried anymore. And it wasn't just ancient forces that wanted it silenced. Miriam awoke to the wail of distant sirens and the heavy stillness of early dawn in Jerusalem. The city was slowly coming alive, but her mind was already racing. She spent the morning decoding the mirrored manuscript with Yonatan in the museum's lower archives. The two documents, when aligned, revealed a hidden column of text between the lines, an ancient scribal trick used by mystics. The phrase repeated itself like a whisper. "The covenant is dual. The oath is shared." Miriam shivered. It was as though the parchment itself wanted to speak. What had been concealed in spiritual metaphor now hinted at a concrete bond, one forged centuries before the founding of either modern nation. Outside the museum, a black SUV idled across the street. Miriam caught sight of it in the reflection of a window pane. Two figures sat inside, unmoving. She didn't tell Yonatan. Instead, she took high-resolution scans of the entire parchment, saving them to an encrypted drive. "If anything happens," she told him, "send this to my brother in Boston. He knows what to do." Yonatan nodded solemnly, but said nothing. As she left, a crowd of tourists surged by. But she felt isolated, like a marked figure in a chess game where she didn't know the rules. She decided to visit an old contact, Rabbi Eliyahu Zohar, a respected but reclusive Kabbalist who lived near Mount Zion. His home was more of a study than a residence. Walls lined with obscure scrolls and incense curling from unseen corners. Miriam showed him the scan. The old man didn't even blink. "Ah," he murmured, "the twin flame covenant. I once thought it myth." He explained that in certain mystical schools, it was believed the divine contract made with ancient Israel was echoed by a later nation destined to guard the outer world. "You Americans," he said, "you are not Rome reborn. You are a sibling. And siblings, like twins, often fight." Rabbi Zohar warned her that certain groups, both religious and secular, had long tried to bury or distort this connection. If it becomes public, it changes everything: alliances, theologies, even wars. Miriam felt the weight of the parchment in her bag, like a live ember. "And what should I do with it?" she asked. The rabbi shrugged, then smiled gently. "You already know the answer. You wouldn't have come if you didn't." His cryptic blessing stayed with her as she stepped back into the sunlight, unsure if it was wisdom or dismissal. Later that evening, she received an anonymous text. "They know you have the copies. Burn them." Miriam's stomach turned cold. No name, no number, just a warning. She smashed the SIM card and flushed it down the toilet. The time for caution was over. If they knew about the digital scans, it meant she was being tracked. And yet, even with danger circling, the idea of destroying the documents felt like betrayal, not of history, but of something sacred. The truth was alive now, and it demanded a reckoning. The next morning, Miriam boarded a train to Tel Aviv, blending in with commuters, scrolling through their phones, and sipping strong coffee. Beneath her coat, the flash drive containing the scanned manuscript was taped to her back. Her every step felt surveilled. As the train curved along the Mediterranean coast, her thoughts spiraled. How could forgotten scroll tie America and Israel in a spiritual bond? Why had no scholar uncovered this before? Or worse, had someone discovered it and chosen to bury it? The possibility made her skin crawl. The covenant wasn't just ancient. It was dangerous. She met her contact at a rooftop cafe in central Tel Aviv. David Stein, a freelance intelligence analyst and former Mossad consultant, greeted her without ceremony. "You look like you're being hunted," he said flatly. Miriam didn't laugh. She laid out everything: the manuscript, the decoding, the threats. David's face darkened. You're dealing with something old and classified. There's a reason no one talks about the Twin Nations theory anymore. He pulled out a dossier, a declassified CIA briefing from the 80s. Scribbled in the margin were 2 words in Hebrew: fire and cloud. Fire and cloud, David explained, was a code name for a theoretical alliance, a spiritual axis between the prophetic origins of Israel and the emerging power of America during the Cold War. It was dismissed publicly as myth, but off record, some believed it was the blueprint for covert global influence. Miriam listened, stunned. It wasn't just about shared values or religion. This was a metaphysical strategy. If that's true, she asked, who's guarding it now? David hesitated. Nobody guards myths, but people kill to protect narratives. That night, Miriam couldn't sleep. In her hotel room, she reviewed the manuscript again, zooming in on fine brushstrokes between the lines. Hidden symbols began to emerge, glyphs resembling maps or perhaps rituals, but they weren't from any ancient Semitic language she knew. One caught her eye, a circle within a square, flanked by 2 lions. It was the seal of a forgotten sect, the Sons of Dayton. Legend said they were wiped out in the 11th century for heresy, but here they were, preserved in ink and shadow. Could this be their final message? As dawn broke, Miriam packed her things and left without checking out. Her plan had changed. She no longer sought just to understand the covenant. She needed to trace its stewards, those still loyal to its truth or its concealment. Her next stop would be a small monastery in the Galilee, rumored to house scrolls from the Crusader era. Before she left, David handed her a burner phone. When you get there, he said, call this number, ask for the keeper of 2 lamps. Miriam nodded. Whatever she had begun, she couldn't turn back now. The Galilean hills rolled beneath a soft morning haze as Miriam drove north, each mile peeling away the trappings of the modern world. Her rented car crawled along narrow roads that curved around ancient olive groves and dry riverbeds. With every turn, the landscape grew quieter, more solemn, as if time itself slowed in these highlands. Her destination, the monastery of Ein Kedem, a crumbling stone relic barely mentioned in travel guides but whispered about in underground forums. It was said to be the last resting place of scrolls, too controversial for museums or synagogues. The monastery appeared almost suddenly, built into a cliffside, its facade partially swallowed by ivy and moss. Miriam parked in silence and approached on foot, greeted by an iron gate covered in rust and vines. An old monk, blind in one eye, opened the door before she could knock. "You've brought the shadow," he said in English tinged with Aramaic. Startled, Miriam stepped back, but he simply turned and walked into the courtyard. She followed, instinct overriding caution. The walls around her were filled with faded frescoes, biblical scenes overlaid with esoteric symbols, like lions holding scrolls and stars bleeding light. In the heart of the sanctuary, the monk led her to a chamber lined with wooden cabinets, each sealed with wax. From one, he retrieved a velvet-wrapped bundle. Inside lay a tattered scroll, its parchment darkened by centuries, its ink faded but legible. Miriam's breath caught as she read the title, "The Witness of the Divided Flame." It mirrored the phrase encoded in her original manuscript. The monk placed a hand on her shoulder. This was never meant for kings or clerics. It was written for watchers, for those who guard the covenant from both glory and ruin. The words echoed in her soul. That night, the monastery hummed with silence. Miriam studied the scroll, cross-referencing it with digital notes on her flash drive. Passages spoke of twin nations, one formed a prophecy, the other a promise. Together, they were to rise at the end of an age, one holding fire, the other cloud. The words were poetic, even apocalyptic. Yet among the verses was a map, encoded using geometrical patterns, pointing not to a place but convergence. Washington, D.C. The realization sent chills through her. The covenant wasn't hidden in a cave. It was embedded in the foundations of power. As she prepared to leave, the monk handed her a small silver medallion, a lion entwined with star. "Keep this," he said. "There are others like you, but not all are kind." Miriam tucked it into her bag, understanding now that her quest was no longer academic. It was a pilgrimage through shadows and symbols, tracing a covenant hidden not just from enemies, but from history itself. She thanked the monk and descended into the dawn. Her path was clear now. The Book of Two Nations had begun to speak. Back in Washington, D.C., The city's symmetry felt different to Miriam, as if each marble monument now whispered in code. She returned not just with information, but with conviction. The scroll had cracked open a layer of meaning behind symbols she had previously dismissed. Obelisks, domes, and street grids weren't merely architectural choices. They were blueprints echoing the divided flame mentioned in the manuscript. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, she traced the geometry with her eyes and realized someone in the founding era had already known. The covenant was not merely theological, it was constitutional. Her research led her underground, literally. In a restricted archives room beneath the Library of Congress, Miriam used her credentials to request a copy of a forgotten draft of the Constitution annotated by Charles Thomson, a lesser-known founding father and devout theologian. Hidden in the margins were esoteric marks resembling Hebrew mysticism, symbols mirrored in the Ein Kedem scroll. Thomson hadn't just edited records. He had encrypted prophecy into national law. Miriam photographed each page, her hands trembling. She wasn't just studying history anymore. She was walking in its concealed architecture. She sought out Professor Eli Cohn, a retired semiotics expert known for his controversial work linking biblical prophecy to American institutions. At first skeptical, he grew solemn as Miriam showed him the materials. "You've opened a door others fear to touch," he murmured. He warned her of the Order of the Double Veil, an obscure sect within political circles that operated on ancient rites hidden in diplomatic language. They believed in preserving the covenant by controlling how nations evolved. "They won't stop you," he said grimly. "They'll absorb you or erase you." Later that night, Miriam sat alone at her apartment, piecing together a timeline. The founding of Israel in 1948, the Jerusalem Embassy Act, and select U.S. presidential oaths had all coincided with astrological alignments described in the scroll. These were not coincidences. They were part of the cycle. Miriam pinned photographs, symbols, and handwritten notes across her wall, creating a spiderweb of meaning. The phrase from the scroll, "Two fires bound by one oath," haunted her. One fire in Jerusalem, one in Washington. The oath, however, was faltering. Just before dawn, her phone vibrated with a secure message. They know. There was no sender. Heart racing, she grabbed her essentials and rushed out the back stairwell. On the street, a black SUV idled with its headlights off. She slipped into an alley, disappearing into a maze of early morning Georgetown. Every footstep felt like a warning. She now carried not only knowledge, but responsibility. And someone, perhaps the same people guarding the covenant, had decided she was no longer just a scholar. She was a threat. Miriam didn't go home. Instead, she disappeared into the city's older layers. Union Station, forgotten church basements, historical sites that had become tourist traps but once held deeper roles. She disguised herself, using her university badge sparingly, and began working from a tablet in libraries, cafes, and sometimes parked cars. Her goal now was to trace the Order of the Double Veil. What she found was unsettling. Obscure correspondences between 19th century senators and Jerusalem rabbis, encrypted within diplomatic archives. The connection wasn't fictional. It was systemic and centuries old. She realized that the order operated like a relay. Information passed from one generation of insiders to the next through cryptic symbols embedded in public events. Cornerstones, memorial dedications, coded sermons. In one Capitol Rotunda plaque, she noticed the engraving date formed a perfect numeric match to a line from Ezekiel, chapter and verse, time-coded into metal. The prophecy was not just fulfilled, it was orchestrated. Miriam's worldview fractured. If prophecy could be weaponized as policy, what separated revelation from manipulation? One night, a note was slipped under her temporary hostel door. It read, "Meet me where two nations kneel to one God." After hours of decoding, she figured out the Washington National Cathedral. The next morning, she slipped inside during morning prayers. A man in a navy overcoat sat 3 pews ahead. He turned only slightly and murmured, "We preserve balance. You stir chaos." His eyes were sunken with age, but his voice carried authority. He slid her a worn page, an untranslated fragment from Ein Kedem. Then he vanished down the aisle. The fragment held a curse, not metaphorical, but literal. It warned that if the fire of Israel ever consumed more than its allotted sphere, its twin would falter. Miriam sat for hours translating the Hebrew. The twin wasn't a person. It was America's foundational mythos, its sense of chosen identity. One flame rising too far would smother the other. But someone, somewhere, was forcing imbalance. The fragment ended with a name. Not a name from the past. A current senator. The covenant wasn't just history. It was now. Miriam left the cathedral as the bells rang, feeling both protected and hunted. The order wasn't simply a relic. It had adapted, modernized. Its members wore suits, not robes. They passed legislation, not liturgies. And yet, at its core, they still believed in ancient oaths and divine mechanisms. As she stepped into the sunlight, a man on a bench across the street lowered his newspaper to reveal a look of recognition. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. Miriam knew now. She was being observed everywhere. Miriam booked a one-way ticket to Jerusalem under a false name. The senator's identity from the scroll fragment led her to a hidden connection. He had studied briefly at a theological institute in East Jerusalem, a program rumored to be a cover for diplomatic grooming. Landing in Israel under the fading dusk, Miriam felt something shift, an ancestral weight settling in her chest. The city's walls weren't just ancient. They were alive with buried intentions. She wasn't here as a tourist or a researcher anymore. She was a participant. Her first destination was the Theological Institute, nestled between modern apartment blocks. The campus looked inconspicuous. Tan stone, iron gate, Hebrew letters faint with age. But its archives were not forgotten. After bribing a junior archivist with the promise of an American university recommendation, Miriam was led to a basement room sealed off from public view. Scrolls were arranged beside government briefing folders. Devotion and diplomacy shelved together. The senator's signature appeared on a student thesis titled Covenantal Duality in Modern Geopolitics. The thesis wasn't just academic. It was a blueprint, an ideological fusion of American exceptionalism and Zionist prophecy. According to it, both nations were bound in a mirrored fate, requiring one to sacrifice freedom to the other's ascendancy at key intervals in history. Miriam was stunned. This wasn't a rogue theory. It was a practiced belief. Embedded within the thesis were footnotes referencing real meetings between American clergy and Mossad advisors in the 1970s. Each historical crisis, oil embargoes, wars, elections, had been tipped by the Covenant's hidden architects. As Miriam copied pages, she heard footsteps echo above. Someone else had arrived. She hid behind a cabinet, breath held, as a figure entered, dark suit, American accent, murmuring into a calm's earpiece. She's here. Archive's been touched. The man didn't search. He simply placed something on the table. A postcard showing the Dome of the Rock with the words Wrong Mountain scrawled across the back. When he left, Miriam emerged, staring at the card. A message? A warning? Or a directive to her next destination? Later that night, Miriam stood near the Temple Mount. Tourists were gone. A full moon hung above like a watchful eye. She looked toward the ancient walls, heart hammering. Was this where the lines converged? Jerusalem was a city of faiths, but also of fractures. Her path forward would not be through safe academic inquiry. It would require choices, alignments, and perhaps even betrayal. In that moment, she understood the covenant wasn't about two nations. It was about one soul split between them, and hers was now caught in the rift. The next morning, Miriam followed the cryptic message on the postcard. Wrong Mountain. Her search led her not to the Temple Mount, but to the Mount of Olives, a place of prophecy, graves, and whispered endings. Beneath the olive trees, she met Elias, a retired archaeologist with shaky hands and a sharper memory. He had worked with American diplomats in the 1980s on an unauthorized excavation just below the mountain's southern slope. His reward, silence. But now, something in Miriam's face moved him to speak again. Elias led Miriam through a locked cemetery gate, down a path few pilgrims tread. They arrived at a stone outcrop with unnatural seams, evidence of a covered entrance. They sealed it with concrete, he said, but they left the map. He handed her a faded parchment, half-burned, marked with obscure Hebrew notations, and a seal combining a menorah with a compass rose. Elias claimed the Americans believed prophetic scroll had been buried there. Something older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, something linking ancient Israel with a future empire. Miriam returned to her hotel that night and spread the map across the bed. The seal matched one she had seen in the senator's thesis. Layers were converging. The political blueprint, the theological writings, the hidden artifacts. They weren't just theories. They were part of an engineered belief system, spanning decades and guided by a shared vision of divine destiny. Miriam began digitally overlaying the map onto satellite images, narrowing in on the coordinates. As she worked, the electricity flickered. Someone else was tracing her steps. That night, a coded message came through her encrypted channel. "Stop digging. The covenant holds." It was unsigned. The phrase echoed from the scrolls, the thesis, and the secret meetings. But Miriam had crossed the threshold. The warning was confirmation, not deterrent. She sent a decoy message to her university contacts, then burned her own notes. If they wanted her out, she would go deeper. With the coordinates burned into her memory, she left the hotel with only a flashlight, gloves, and the will to disturb the bones of prophecy. Back at the Mount of Olives before dawn, Miriam descended into a ravine past thorn bushes and limestone ridges. The entrance Elias spoke was there, but freshly sealed with modern cement. Still, the map had marked an alternate tunnel used by priests in the 1st century, according to his notes. She scraped away the dirt, heart pounding. This wasn't a relic hunt anymore. It was trespassing on sacred strategy, cracking open a vault of theology designed to unite or divide nations. As the first stone gave way, Miriam whispered a prayer not to be understood, but to be remembered. The air inside the tunnel was dense and damp, filled with the scent of ancient dust and limestone. Miriam's flashlight flickered as she crawled deeper into the narrow shaft. Every movement scraped her palms against centuries of rough stone. After 20 meters, the passage widened into a small chamber carved by human hands. There, etched into the walls, were symbols that blended Hebrew script with unfamiliar geometric glyphs, like a sacred language forged from 2 cultures. Miriam took careful photographs. This wasn't just history, it was hybrid theology encoded in stone. In the center of the chamber stood a broken pedestal, half buried in debris. Around were remnants of burnt parchment, corroded hinges from a long-gone box, and traces of red wax. Miriam used a brush to uncover what remained, a fragment of a scroll sealed in resin. Though time had made the ink nearly illegible, a single phrase could be read: "Two shall become one, divided by covenant." The language was Aramaic, but the phrasing echoed a line from the book of Isaiah, used recently in political speeches Miriam had cataloged. Suddenly, the ground above her rumbled faintly. She froze, ears straining. Footsteps or shifting earth. Either way, she knew time was short. Miriam photographed the scroll fragment, sealed it in her bag, and moved toward the second corridor Elias had mapped out. This one sloped downward, leading deeper into the earth. As she descended, she passed alcoves holding shattered oil lamps and faded murals of processions, priests, prophets, and what looked like modern buildings sketched in shadowy background, prophetic imagination or deliberate foreshadowing. At the bottom of the stairway, the tunnel opened into a circular chamber lined with 7 arches. Each arch contained a carving of a different religious symbol: the menorah, the cross, a crescent moon, and 4 others less recognizable. In the center, a sunken pit covered in metal latticework. Miriam lowered her light through the grate, and her breath caught. Below, resting on a stone dais, was a box of black wood, inlaid with gold Hebrew letters. The Ark, or a replica made for manipulation? Either answer was history-altering. She heard the voice before she saw him. "You shouldn't be here." From the shadows, a man emerged, early 40s, Middle Eastern features, clean-cut with an accentless English tone. "I thought you might come," he said calmly. "You found the map." His name was Rami, a liaison between the Israeli Antiquities Authority and a private American consortium. But Miriam had seen him in the background of photographs she once dismissed. A man standing beside the senator during a confidential trip to Jerusalem. This discovery wasn't hers alone anymore. Miriam stood frozen, the beam of her flashlight quivering slightly as Rami stepped closer. His expression wasn't hostile. If anything, it was worn down, as if he carried the weight of too many secrets for too long. "They told me someone would come," he said. "Someone who could still believe in both sides." Miriam's mind raced. Was this a trap? Or was he, like her, caught in the middle of something ancient and modern, spiritual and political? She didn't lower her guard, but she listened carefully. Rami moved toward the grated floor, gazing down at the black wooden box beneath. "It's not the Ark," he said. as if reading her thoughts. But it contains documents sealed during the Second Temple period, forbidden writings. Some claim it holds an alternate covenant, one not bound by geography or lineage. He paused. They believe exposing it could dissolve the foundations of two nations. Miriam felt her throat tighten. This wasn't just archaeology. This was doctrine, weaponized, then hidden, a truth too dangerous to belong to either side. I'm not here to take it, Rami said quietly. I'm here to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Miriam narrowed her eyes. Who decides who the right hands are? He smiled faintly, sadness in his face. That's why I needed you. You're the anomaly. They couldn't predict your movements, your loyalties. You weren't trained to be political. You were trained to read. Miriam realized at this moment the choice to reveal or conceal had been architected around her. They had used her curiosity as the final test. Rami handed her a small device, a data key. This contains a translation of what's inside the box. I made it years ago. If you want the truth to come out, you'll have what you need. He stepped back, then added, but know this. If you go public, neither Israel nor America will ever see you the same again. You'll be accused of betrayal, of heresy, of treason. Miriam clenched the data key in her fist. The weight of history, belief, and politics now rested in a simple file. She turned and walked back toward the tunnel, feeling every step echo in her chest. Behind her, Rami remained still, as if guarding the box with his silence. Miriam didn't look back. She emerged into the night alone, stars wheeling overhead like ancient sentinels. The desert wind whispered through the brush, but her thoughts were louder. Could truth exist without allegiance? Could she serve knowledge without becoming its martyr? She didn't have answers, only questions wrapped in shadow and silence. The ride back into Jerusalem was silent. Miriam kept the data key hidden inside her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against it every few minutes as if it might vanish. She had expected to feel clarity, maybe even triumph. Instead, her thoughts were a tangle of conflicting voices. The city skyline emerged under the first light of dawn, domes and antennas casting long shadows across stone walls. It was beautiful, yes, but no longer innocent in her eyes. Every ancient brick now seemed complicit in keeping secrets. She checked into a modest hotel near the old city walls. The room was sparse, almost monastic, with a creaky wooden bed and one narrow window, looking out over the rooftops. Miriam placed the data key on the desk and stared at it. What if it really did contain something world-altering? She knew too well how ancient documents could be taken out of context, how belief could be weaponized. The truth wasn't enough. It had to be protected, explained, understood, and that would take more than just a leak. She emailed David but received no reply. Something was wrong. By noon, she slipped into a local cafe frequented by academics. She spotted a familiar face, Professor Eli Lavin, one of David's old mentors. He looked up from his coffee, surprised to see her. "You shouldn't be here," he said before she even sat down. "David's been detained." Miriam's breath caught. Detained? For what? Lavin glanced around nervously. They said he was handling restricted documents. They found photos from the Dead Sea caves. Yours, I suspect. Miriam's stomach turned. They were being hunted now. "I need your help," she said firmly. Lavin hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Whatever this is, you've stumbled into something governments have fought to suppress for decades." He tapped the side of his cup. Israel and America made a pact long ago to keep certain discoveries buried. Too divisive, too dangerous. If what you found contradicts a traditional covenant, it could unravel political legitimacy on both sides. Miriam looked down. Then maybe it needs to unravel. But Parver still feared what chaos that might unleash. She left the cafe with a plan. Lavin would contact a discreet scholar in Germany who specialized in suppressed religious texts. Miriam would book a flight under an alias and disappear before anyone could follow. But first, she had to see David. She couldn't leave him behind. The sun dipped low behind the dome of the rock as she crossed the city. In her mind, the data key felt heavier than ever. No longer just information, but the spark to a fire she wasn't sure she could control. The holding facility was nothing like she expected, tucked behind a nondescript government building. It had no signage and no security guards in visible uniform. Miriam stood outside, the stone facade pressing inward like judgment. She had used a contact from Lavin to secure a 10-minute visitation under false credentials. The lobby was sterile and silent, and as the door buzzed open, her heartbeat matched the blinking fluorescent lights above. David was in a small glass-walled room, seated, hands folded tightly in front of him. When their eyes met, he smiled faintly. He looked thinner than before. His shirt was wrinkled, his face drawn, but his voice still had that calm certainty. "I told them nothing," he said. "They're trying to frame this as an act of academic espionage." Miriam shook her head. "We need to get you out. I'm leaving soon for Berlin." David frowned. "They'll watch every airport." She slid a hand under the table and passed him a scrap of paper. Coordinates, names, a burner number. His fingers closed around it without looking. "You always plan ahead," he murmured. "I've had to." The minutes evaporated. As she rose to leave, David whispered, "There's more than the scrolls. Lavin knows. He's been playing both sides." Miriam stopped mid-step. "What do you mean?" His eyes darkened. "He was present at the dig 10 years ago. The scrolls we found weren't the first. They were curated." That single word hit her like a slap. Someone had chosen what they were allowed to find, and what was to be kept buried. Her thoughts scrambled. "Why didn't you tell me before?" David looked away. "I wasn't sure until now." She exited the building with her mind racing. Lavin, the mentor, the guide, the cautious conspirator, had hidden the scope of the truth. But why? To protect history? Or to serve a greater agenda? She wandered down a side alley, passing shuttered shops and faded posters. Suddenly, she felt followed. A shadow moved 2 buildings down. She picked up pace, heart thumping. Turning sharply, she ducked into an old bookstore she remembered from years ago. The bell above the door rang like a lifeline. Inside, it smelled of parchment and dust, and the world quieted. The store owner, an elderly Arab man, greeted her with knowing eyes. "You still running?" he asked in Arabic. She smiled faintly. "Always." He motioned her toward the back, through a curtain of strings. The back room was a chaos of scrolls, antique Qurans, Hebrew codices. Here, knowledge slept in 1,000 languages. She sat down, catching her breath, and whispered into her phone. "Berlin, 2 days. Package is live." She pressed send. There was no turning back. What she carried was no longer a secret. It was a threat, a salvation, a revelation. Berlin greeted Miriam with steel skies and cold air. The city pulsed beneath her feet as she stepped off the train at Hauptbahnhof. Her coat pulled tightly around her. She wasn't just crossing borders. She was stepping deeper into a mystery that no longer felt academic. Berlin had always been a city of duality, of walls and reunions, of secrets and revelation. Her contact, Elias, had secured a safe flat in Prenzlauer Berg. It wasn't lavish, but it had thick walls, blackout curtains, and a satellite phone inside a hollowed-out Bible. She smiled at the irony. Elias arrived that evening, bringing with him a flash drive encrypted with layers of keys known only to a few within the old archive community. He was younger than she remembered, perhaps hardened by the years, perhaps sharpened. "The Vatican files were redacted in 1987, he whispered. "Before that, there was a record. Now there's only a void." She took the drive with shaking fingers. It held blueprints of an ancient underground vault beneath Jerusalem, rumored to contain artifacts too dangerous for public knowledge. "Who has access?" she asked. Elias looked grim. "The people who no longer believe in God, but know he existed." That night, she couldn't sleep. The walls, despite their thickness, seemed to listen. She laid out her notes, the decoded sections of the scroll, and a timeline scrawled in 3 languages. The connections between American religious lobbyists, Israeli archaeologists, and Vatican scholars grew tighter and darker. A phrase kept repeating in her head. "The book of 2 nations shall not be read by one alone." She didn't know if it was prophecy or warning. Something was being hidden not just from the world, but from each nation, as if no one could be trusted with the full truth. In the morning, she met Elias at a church converted into an archive center. Its stained glass windows remained intact, casting kaleidoscopic light on rows of digital scanners and archivists. They descended to the basement, where digitalization teams were working on centuries-old codices. Elias pulled out a single leather-bound volume. "This," he said, contains references to Sefer Erech, what some believe is the precursor to your scroll. It was written in Aramaic, Greek, and fragments of early Latin, a trilingual code meant to bridge or divide. She traced her finger across the vellum, feeling the gravity of voices lost to time. As they left, a message arrived on Miriam's secure line. He's escaped. It was David. The message was brief and untraceable. He was on the move again. That changed everything. Their clock had reset, but the danger hadn't lessened. If anything, the stakes had risen. Someone had helped him escape. Someone inside. It meant factions existed within factions. Miriam walked silently through the Berlin streets, her thoughts a cacophony. This wasn't a single conspiracy. It was a symphony of silence, a chorus of partial truths. And she had just heard the next note. The next leg of Miriam's journey took her to Tel Aviv, a city pulsing with modernity, yet teetering on layers of sacred history. She touched down at Ben Gurion Airport on the glare of midday sun, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her mind consumed by what the Book of Two Nations might truly mean. The cab ride from the airport carried her through bustling streets, crowded markets, and neighborhoods where tension and resilience coexisted. The rhythm of Israel was unlike anything she had experienced. Urgent, ancient, alive. Her contact here was Dr. Gideon Malak, a biblical linguist turned political advisor. They met in a quiet cafe near Rothschild Boulevard, hidden behind an iron gate and flowering vines. Gideon was thin, bespectacled, and nervous. He spoke in whispers even when no one was around. There are people in high places who believe your scroll is a blueprint, one that threatens the legitimacy of both states, he said. It speaks of a covenant made before Abraham. That changes everything. Miriam felt her breath catch. If that were true, the entire Abrahamic foundation would need rewriting, and not everyone would welcome that. Gideon provided access to a classified museum vault beneath the Eretz Israel Museum. It required biometric clearance, and even then, only a short window of time. In the dim, climate-controlled chamber, Miriam was shown a stone fragment etched with symbols nearly identical to those on her scroll. "We call it the twin inscription," Gideon said. "It's been dated older than any Hebrew record we've ever found, and it was discovered in the Sinai near a military zone." She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, struck by its quiet gravity. The world had built its nations on half-truths. Now the other half was surfacing. Outside, a protest had erupted unexpectedly. Shouts filled the air, and riot police lined the street near the museum exit. It wasn't about the scroll, but Miriam knew the unrest mirrored something deeper. People were tired. Truths were surfacing in political chambers and sacred places alike, and pressure was building. Gideon walked her quickly through side alleys and hidden passages, using old routes from his military days. "They don't know what you're carrying," he said, "but they can feel it. The truth isn't just dangerous, it's contagious." And that made her both powerful and vulnerable. Back in her safe house, Miriam reviewed her notes under flickering fluorescent lights. The scroll, the twin inscription, David's cryptic message, and now this covenant that predated all known tradition. They were forming a constellation of secrets. And somewhere at the center was a truth so ancient, so potentially unifying or divisive, that both America and Israel were working silently to control it. She circled one phrase in her notebook. Before the promise, there was a pact. What did that mean? And who had kept it hidden for so long? Miriam received a coded message early the next morning. The sender was cryptic, Lion of Ephraim, but the instructions were clear. Meet at a synagogue in Jaffa before sunrise. She walked alone through the sleeping city, fog clinging to cobblestones and iron railings. The synagogue was old, its exterior worn by sea winds and centuries of prayer. Inside, a single man sat near the ark, shrouded in shadow. "You are carrying what was never meant to be unearthed," he said, not looking at her. "But now that it has surfaced, it must be understood." His voice was old, accented, and firm. Miriam felt the weight of history settle on her shoulders. The man introduced himself as Rabbi Reuben Halevi, keeper of oral traditions dating back to pre-temple times. He told Miriam that the scroll was likely linked to the Aliyah Code, a forbidden doctrine whispered about in yeshivas but never recorded. "It speaks of a dual promise," he said. "One made to a people, the other to a stranger. Both must be fulfilled, or both are broken." Reuben removed a dusty box from beneath a floorboard. Inside was a page, brittle with age, bearing a fragment of the same script Miriam had found in the scroll. "This," he said, "is the other half." Miriam scanned the text. It referenced a covenant formed between those who traveled across water and those who watched from the mountain. She remembered the frescoes she saw in Boston, the ship and the flame. Could this be what it was depicting? A covenant split across continents, buried by power and time? Reuben explained that the rabbis had hidden this knowledge after the fall of the Second Temple. Not out of fear, he said, but because timing is sacred, and until now, the world wasn't ready to remember. Miriam realized she was part of something not just political, but prophetic. As they exited the synagogue, Reuben pressed a small amulet into Miriam's palm. "This will open a chamber beneath the western wall," he whispered. "There are more fragments, but only someone marked by the text can retrieve them." Miriam stared at the object, bronze, worn, engraved with symbols she now knew by heart. She didn't ask how he knew this. Something about the moment transcended explanation. "The divide must be bridged," Reuben said, "before others use it to divide us further." His eyes burned with urgency. The future of two nations, perhaps the world, was shifting beneath their feet. Later that day, Miriam stood before the ancient stones of the western wall, tourists bustling around her unaware. The amulet pulsed warm in her hand. She found the crevice Reuben described and inserted the piece. A faint click echoed. Then a narrow passage revealed itself, heart racing. She descended into the darkness, her flashlight barely illuminating the carved steps. The air grew colder, heavier. It was not just stone she was walking into. It was memory, sealed and waiting. And whatever lay ahead, she was certain it would alter everything she thought she knew about her country, her faith, and herself. The tunnel behind the western wall narrowed quickly, stone walls pressing close on either side. Miriam's footsteps echoed with unsettling clarity. Carvings lined the walls, symbols she recognized from the scrolls and the amulet. They pulsed faintly under her flashlight beam, some glowing dim blue when touched. After minutes of descent, she reached a vaulted chamber where torches inexplicably burned. At the center stood a pedestal with a sealed box, its surface adorned with the twin crests of two ancient houses, one bearing a menorah, the other a stylized eagle. It was the first physical evidence that America and Israel had been linked long before modern diplomacy. Miriam opened the box slowly. Inside lay a second scroll, older than the first, ink flaking but legible. It was written in both Paleo-Hebrew and Early English, mirroring each line. As she read, a narrative unfolded of pilgrims fleeing persecution, not only from Europe, but ancient sects within Jerusalem, bringing with them a covenant scroll as both map and key. These settlers had landed on American shores bearing ancient knowledge, and the task of merging two destinies. The scroll was a declaration, a fusion of divine mandates, meant to unify a people scattered across continents. As she absorbed the implications, Miriam heard soft movement. Someone else was in the chamber. She turned sharply, flashlight scanning the perimeter. A man stepped into the torchlight. It was Daniel, the intelligence agent. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, yet without menace. "But I knew you'd come." Miriam held the scroll close. "Then you know I can't let this be buried again." Daniel looked at the glowing crests. "I don't want it buried, but others do." He pulled a small device from his coat and pressed a button. A camera hidden in the chamber. Ceiling began transmitting live. "We go public now," Daniel said. "No more secrets. No more brokers deciding what the people should know." Miriam hesitated. "They'll call it forgery, conspiracy." He nodded. "At first, but not forever. The truth doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient." Together, they activated the live stream, beginning to read from the scroll. Words echoed through cyberspace. Moments later, Miriam's phone buzzed with alerts. Hidden covenant discovered. Ancient link between nations revealed. The world was watching, and the chamber beneath Jerusalem was no longer just a tomb. It was a stage. Outside, chaos stirred. News stations scrambled, governments issued statements, and scholars debated authenticity. Some hailed it as divine revelation, others as dangerous myth-making. But Miriam didn't waver. She returned the scroll to the pedestal, sealing it again with reverence. "Let the truth live here," she whispered, "but never be hidden again." Daniel nodded, then led her back up the tunnel, where the first light of dawn spilled into the streets of Jerusalem. Above ground, the world had changed overnight, and the divide between two nations had become a bridge. The media firestorm that followed was unprecedented. Within hours, the footage from the underground chamber had gone viral, translated into dozens of languages. Talk show hosts, rabbis, pastors, professors, and conspiracy theorists debated its meaning. Governments issued vague statements, neither confirming nor denying its authenticity. Miriam watched from a modest hotel room in Jerusalem as headlines flipped from reverent to hostile. Some accused her of blasphemy. Others called her a prophet. The air was charged with electricity. Something ancient had stirred, and the world could feel it. Daniel returned to the room with updates from Washington and Tel Aviv. There are factions in both governments pushing for damage control. Others see this as a diplomatic opportunity. Miriam was skeptical. Opportunity? They'll twist this to fit their agendas. Daniel agreed. But it's also a rare window. People are asking questions they were never allowed to ask. That night, Miriam gave a quiet interview to an international journalist known for integrity. She spoke not of revolution, but of reconciliation. This isn't about power, she said. It's about remembering what was lost between us. The next morning, crowds had gathered outside sacred sites in both nations. At the National Mall in Washington, D.C., people held candles and sang old hymns. In Jerusalem, a silent vigil stretched along the Western Wall. Despite political noise, something deeper had emerged, an awakening. Religious leaders, long divided, held joint prayer sessions. Statements of solidarity came from Christian, Jewish, and even secular groups. The text of the scroll had ignited a hunger, not just for truth, but for unity. The Book of Two Nations, as people had come to call it, wasn't just a relic. It was a mirror. Still, threats loomed. An anonymous warning was sent to Miriam's hotel, coded but clear. Some truths deserve silence. Daniel increased security, but Miriam refused to hide. She began speaking at universities, faith centers, and live streaming Q&As. She never claimed to be a prophet or savior, only a scholar following the evidence. But every time she held up the scroll or quoted its dual-language lines, people listened. Not all agreed, but even skeptics couldn't deny the emotional impact. Something real had surfaced, and it no longer belonged to governments or ancient bloodlines. It belonged to the people. In a final symbolic act, Miriam proposed placing a replica of the scroll in both nations' capitals. Not behind glass, she said, but in open public space, accessible to all. The idea was controversial, but the public responded overwhelmingly in favor. Artists began crafting interpretations, blending Hebrew calligraphy with colonial motifs. A ceremony was planned, not led by politicians, but by children, one from Jerusalem, one from Washington, reading the first lines in unison. As that date approached, Miriam felt something she hadn't in years. Hope, fragile but radiant, like the scroll itself. As the date of the dual ceremonies approached, tensions ran high. While the majority of the public embraced a symbolic gesture of unity, extremist factions on both sides grew louder. In Jerusalem, protests erupted near the Knesset, some denouncing the scroll as a fabrication. In D.C., fringe groups accused Miriam of undermining national sovereignty. "You're rewriting history," one protester shouted during a press briefing. Miriam stood firm. "We are remembering it," she replied. Security around the events was doubled, and intelligence agencies warned of credible threats. But the ceremonies would go on. The first ceremony took place in Jerusalem under a sharp blue sky. Thousands gathered near the public plaza facing the old city walls. A boy named Eliyahu, 11 years old and wide-eyed, stepped forward with a scroll replica in hand. "In the beginning," he said in Hebrew, "we were one." His voice trembled but didn't break. Across the square, a gospel choir from Georgia sang a traditional spiritual, bridging continents in harmony. Tears welled in Miriam's eyes. Despite the critics, despite the threats, the moment felt undeniable. Something was shifting. Hours later, a similar ceremony unfolded in Washington, D.C., in front of the Capitol. A young girl named Naomi, of Israeli and African-American descent, held the second replica. "In truth," she began in English, "we find each other." Behind her stood interfaith leaders, military veterans, students, and artists, all unified in silent reverence. Drones captured sweeping shots of the crowd, and the event trended worldwide under the hashtag Scroll of Unity. The president made a brief, carefully worded appearance, choosing humility over politics. "We are listening," she said. Finally, in the days following, something extraordinary happened. Pilgrimages began. People from around the world traveled to the sites where the replicas stood. They came not just out of curiosity, but out of longing. Some prayed, some meditated. Others simply sat in silence. Artists left drawings and poems. Veterans recited names of lost comrades. Young activists debated theology over coffee. The scroll had become more than text. It was now a symbol of possibility, a relic that demanded courage, not obedience. For many, it wasn't about what the scroll said. It was about what it asked of them. Back in her hotel room, Miriam sat with Daniel, exhausted but content. "We didn't solve anything," she said. "No," Daniel replied, "but we started something." They turned off the television, unplugged their devices, and simply sat in quiet reflection. For all the chaos, the journey had been about connection. Between past and present, between nations, between souls. The Book of Two Nations would never be shelved in a library or locked in a vault. It had passed into memory, into movement. And in that quiet moment, they both understood. It was only the beginning. The aftermath was not a perfect resolution, but a reckoning. Across both America and Israel, the conversation shifted. News channels hosted theologians, historians, and activists discussing the implications of the ancient scroll. Schools added new materials to their curricula about early Semitic migration and transcontinental religious ties. Even late-night comedians couldn't ignore it, mocking, yes, but also pondering. In Tel Aviv, street murals began to appear depicting Naomi and Eliyahu holding the scroll together. The art wasn't government-sanctioned. It was organic, a signal that the message had seeped into the culture at large. Miriam returned to academia, but never quite the same. Her lectures took on a personal tone, weaving narrative with discovery. She was invited to lecture globally, from Oxford to Cape Town, and everywhere she went, students greeted her not just as a scholar, but as a symbol. "You taught us that faith isn't static," one student in Tokyo told her. "It's a living conversation." She declined interviews from major media outlets, refusing to commodify the moment. For Miriam, the real work was not in headlines but in hearts, in classrooms, quiet libraries, and sacred silences. Daniel, too, found a new path. He resigned from his intelligence post and joined a grassroots diplomatic initiative focusing on interfaith dialogue. Fluent in both political nuance and spiritual metaphor, he became an unexpected bridge between diplomats and religious leaders. At a summit in Istanbul, he spoke of the shared tremble between prayers, earning a standing ovation. When asked later why he left the government, he answered, "I realize the best intelligence is empathy." His work continued in small rooms, across coffee tables, where change often begins unseen. The scroll itself was returned to a custom vault, but not hidden away. It would travel as part of a curated exhibition called Echoes of Origin, co-hosted by Smithsonian affiliates and Israeli cultural institutes. Children walked past it with wide eyes. Elders stood still before it, some in tears. Not everyone agreed on what it meant, and that ultimately was its gift. The scroll didn't answer a question. It gave the world permission to ask deeper ones. As one curator said, "It's not a relic, it's a mirror." On a warm spring evening years later, Naomi and Eliyahu met again in Jerusalem. Now teenagers, they stood before the plaza where it had all begun. "Do you think anything really changed?" Naomi asked. Eliyahu shrugged, smiling. "We did." They laughed, then fell into thoughtful silence. Above them, the sky turned amber. For all the turmoil, all the uncertainty, the story had grown roots. And beneath those roots, a covenant, not just between nations, but between people, whispered its ancient promise once more. "Seek truth, and you will find each other."